The hall held the kind of silence that assemblies manufacture when they want a verdict to feel inevitable. Daria stood at the center of it, her wrists locked in iron, the chain running between them taut enough that she could not lower her arms past her waist. She had been standing in this position for a long time. The torch smoke had already settled into the back of her throat, and the floor beneath her feet was cold stone worn smooth by the passage of boots that belonged to people with places to go. The Alpha King had not yet looked at her. He sat at the far end of the hall on a raised seat that was not quite a throne, but that no one present would have dared call anything else, and his attention appeared fixed on some point above the assembled council. She had expected someone larger. What she had not expected was the stillness, the way the air around him organized itself differently than it did around ordinary men, as though the room understood something about him that she did not yet. Elder Varric was speaking. He had been speaking for nearly 10 minutes, and he had managed to say almost nothing of fact while making her feel the weight of each word like a stone placed carefully on her sternum. The charges had been named twice. The writ had been read aloud. The name of the border warden she was accused of killing had been spoken with a specific gravity that Varric clearly enjoyed, because he had used it 3 times. She was watching the king. She could not say exactly when he moved. One moment he was seated. The next he was walking toward her across the stone floor, and the hall, which had been murmuring with the low current of Varric's address, went entirely still. He stopped in front of her. She looked up. His eyes moved to the iron at her wrists and then to her face, and something crossed his expression that was not quite a question and not quite a conclusion. He reached for the lock at her left wrist. She heard the key engage. The chain fell. Not, "You may be released." Not, "Bring the key." Himself. The court did not breathe. She had told herself, in the 7 days since the riders came for her, that she would not allow this place to find an edge on her. Standing in that silence with her wrists suddenly bare and aching, watching the most powerful man in Ironfall step back one pace and look at her as though he were the one making a careful assessment, she understood that she had somewhat misjudged the difficulty of that resolution. If you want to understand how she arrived at the center of that floor, you might want to stay with this one. It had begun 12 years after the Blood Moon Pact dissolved. The compound had been her grandmother's, before the dissolution, and before that, her grandmother's mother's, and the territorial claim ran so far back that it was recorded not in Ironfall's ledgers but in carved stone at the border ruin she had lived beside for the past 3 seasons. She was 22. She had a fire, a preserved store of dried provisions, a bedroll that had seen better winters, and a working knowledge of the eastern border's watershed that she had built by walking every foot of it herself. She had no pack. She had no bond, false or otherwise. She had, until 7 days ago, had no significant contact with anyone carrying the king's authority. The 7 riders arrived at first light. She heard the horses before she saw them, and she was already standing at the door of the ruin when they came through the frost-stripped tree line. The lead rider carried the writ in a sealed document case, which he opened with the particular practiced care of someone who has learned that the way you open a document carries as much authority as what is written inside it. The writ named her. It named a border warden called Ordrin, described his death at the northern crossing, and placed her at that crossing on the day of his death. It bore the Pack Council's seal. She had been at the eastern ruin for the entirety of that day. She could name every hour of it. She said, "I was not at the northern crossing on that date." The lead rider said, "The writ names you." She said, "The writ is wrong." He was not unkind about it, which was its own form of discouragement. He waited while she put on her heavier coat. He allowed her to bank the fire. He did not strike her when she kept her eyes level as they bound her wrists, though she had expected him to, and she thought the expectation itself was its own kind of wound. The knowledge that she had lived long enough at the border ruins that she had come to assume the worst from authority as a matter of course. The ride to Ironfall took 3 days. She memorized the riders' faces. She memorized the route. She did not speak again unless spoken to, and they did not often speak to her. On the second day, the youngest rider, who could not have been older than 19, offered her water without being asked. She drank it without thanking him, because she had decided that performing gratitude for basic decency was a habit she would not carry into the place where she was being taken. Ironfall's great hall was lit by 50 torches at minimum when they brought her through the main doors. She had expected fewer witnesses. The pack council occupied the long benches on both sides of the central floor, 5 elders arranged in order of seniority, and behind them the lesser lords and their seconds, and behind those a general tier of court wolves, whose rank she could not immediately parse from their dress. The impression of the room was of a great deal of authority, assembled to watch one unchained wolf be brought to account, and the specific word she chose for it, standing in the doorway with 7 riders at her back and iron at her wrists, was disproportionate. Elder Varric rose before she had reached the center of the floor. He was a tall man, gray-bearded and built with the particular density of someone who had spent decades inside a hierarchy and absorbed its weight into his own body. He waited until the riders had stepped back, and she was standing alone on the stone before he spoke. "The remnant," he said, and the word carried precisely as far as it needed to in that hall. Unchosen and brought to account. It was, she thought, a very efficient piece of phrasing. 3 words to name her standing, or rather, the standing she was not permitted to have. The Blood Moon Remnant. Not daughter of a bloodline, not heir to a territorial claim. Something left over after the useful parts had been accounted for. She looked at him steadily and said nothing. It was at this moment that the Alpha King stood. The hall's noise ceased. He walked toward her across the stone floor with the same unhurried pace she would later come to recognize as the only pace he ever operated at, as though urgency were something that happened to other men. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the iron at her wrists. He said, "Remove it." The lead rider moved forward. Kaelin said, "Not you." And then the Alpha King of Ironfall took the key from the rider's hand and unlocked both shackles himself, and the chain fell to the stone floor with a sound that the hall's silence made enormous, and he stepped back and looked at her wrists and then at her face, and she saw him register the chain mark on her left wrist with an attention that lasted 2 full seconds before his expression closed again. She told herself, "This is political theater. He is demonstrating mercy before the council as a way of establishing the distance between his judgment and whatever informal verdict the room has already reached. He is not looking at you, he is looking at what the riders did, and what that implies about the writ's authority, and whether that creates a procedural problem for the throne." She was probably mostly correct about all of it. What she had not seen was the almost imperceptible movement of Kaelin's right hand, the way his fingers had begun to close before he had drawn them back, a movement that Lyra, standing at the edge of the dais, caught and filed away without changing her expression by so much as a degree. The council was told to reconvene in 3 days' time. She was given a room in the stone corridor below the east wing. The door locked from the outside. The window was high and narrow and looked onto a section of the inner courtyard that no one appeared to use. There was a bed with adequate blankets, a brazier, and a table with a single chair. It was better than the border ruin in every material respect, and she found she trusted it less for exactly that reason. On the first morning, a young Omega servant brought water and a tray of food and set both on the table without looking at her. He was slight and quiet-footed, and he wore the gray braided Omega cord of an Ironfall service binding at his wrist, knotted in the pattern that indicated permanent assignment rather than seasonal work. She said, "What is your name?" He paused at the door and turned only part way. "Bryn." "How long do they typically hold a prisoner before the hearing?" he said, without quite meeting her eyes. 3 days. The council hears on the 4th morning." He hesitated. They usually know the verdict before the hearing begins. She asked, "What does the charge look like to the council?" "Like a closed case," he said, "on a sealed writ." He left. She sat with that for a long time. The second day brought no visitors. On the third, a guard slid a copy of the formal charge under the door. She read it twice. The writ named the date of Ordrin's death as the 14th day of the month of the Grey Turning. She had been at the Eastern Ruin that day. She had no witness who could confirm it, which was not unusual for someone living alone at dissolved Pack ruins, but the charge had been constructed to account for that absence. The document was a piece of administrative work that required time and access to the council's seal, and whoever had built it had not done so hastily. It had been built by someone who knew exactly what a blood moon heir at the eastern border would and would not be able to prove. On the morning of the fourth day, Bryn came again. He brought water and hard bread and stood for a moment longer than his task required. "The council expects a confession," he said, without opening, "or an accomplice named. Either satisfies the writ." She looked at him. "I had no accomplice. I committed no act to have an accomplice in." "I know," he said. He said it in the way that meant only, "I believe you." He did not elaborate. He picked up the empty tray from the day before and went to the door. And she thought about what it meant that a servant in a service-binding cord had said those two words in that particular tone and then chosen not to add a single syllable to them. It meant he was careful. It meant he saw what was happening around her. It meant he held no power to change it, and knew that, and had chosen to speak anyway. She went to the hearing carrying both of those things. The council chamber was smaller than the Great Hall, lit by high windows and 4 standing candelabra. The 5 elders occupied a curved bench at the far end. Varric sat at the center, 2 elders on either side, and their combined attention when she entered carried the particular pressure of people who have already made a decision and are present only to have the proceedings confirm it. The Alpha King was seated to the left of the bench, separated from it by exactly enough distance to indicate he was present as witness and not as participant. He did not look at her when she entered. Varric opened by reading the writ's summary for the record. He then turned to her and said, "The council will hear your accounting." She said, "On the 14th day of the Grey Turning, I was at the eastern ruin of the Blood Moon compound. I did not travel north that day. I did not encounter the border warden Ordrin. I did not kill him." "The writ places you at the northern crossing," Varric said. "The writ is in error." A pause, considered. "The writ carries the council's seal." Then the seal was applied to a document containing false information. She held his gaze and kept her voice level. "The territorial claim of the Blood Moon Pack extends to both the eastern ruin and the northern crossing. My presence at either location is consistent with a bloodline right I hold by direct descent. The writ does not account for that right." Varric said, "The Blood Moon Pact dissolved 12 years ago. Its territorial claims dissolved with it." "The pact dissolved," she said. "The bloodline did not." It was a small distinction, and it was everything. She heard the shift in the room, not sound exactly, more the particular quality of attention that a chamber develops when something has been said that the room's walls were not built to hold. 2 of the 5 elders exchanged a look. The third did not move, but his stillness changed in quality, the stillness of a man recalculating rather than the stillness of a man waiting. Varric let the pause extend for 3 full seconds. Then, "The council will offer the defendant a resolution. Name any second party present at the northern crossing on the date in question, and the charge is reduced to presence at the scene. Sentence becomes a fine and border restriction rather than tribunal action." She looked at him. She had been expecting something like this. She had also been hoping, in whatever small part of herself still permitted hoping, not to be. "There was no second party," she said. "I was not at the crossing. I will not name someone who was not present for a crime that did not occur." "That refusal carries consequences," Varric said. I understand the consequences. The room went very quiet, and in that quiet, from the edge of her peripheral vision, she became aware that the Alpha King had turned his head and was looking at her directly for the first time since the chain had fallen in the Great Hall. She did not look at him. She could not afford to look at him. She did not know what he was thinking in that moment, and she would not let herself wonder, because she had one position left, and it was the only thing still standing between her and a verdict that had been written before she entered this room. She had told the truth. She would not trade it for the softer sentence. Kalen did not move. He was very still, watching her. He had watched a great many things in the council chamber over the years, witnessed confessions offered quickly and arguments collapsed under pressure. And he recognized what was in front of him now as something different, something that cost her, something she was paying in full and without performance. The council conferred in low voices for a count of 90. Varek raised his hand and the murmur stopped. The council finds the defense insufficient, Varek said. Sentencing will be determined at the full court hearing in the Great Hall before the assembled lords. He paused, and in that pause she understood that the fuller verdict had already been arranged, and it had been arranged before she walked through the chamber door, and that what had just taken place was not a hearing. It was a formality wearing a hearing's face. She had refused the one exit they had built for her. She had known from the moment Bryn spoke that morning that they would build exactly this one. The guards were already moving. They led her through a corridor she had not walked before, a long stone passage that ran below the east wing in the direction of the holding rooms, and the sound of her own footsteps was the loudest thing in it. The hearing was over. The sentence would be delivered in the Great Hall, before the assembled lords, which meant the full court, which meant whatever Varek had arranged would be witnessed by everyone in Ironfall with the standing to be present. She understood now what the hearing had been for, not to determine the truth, to produce a record of her refusal, so that the full court sentencing would appear, to anyone reading the proceedings afterward, as the natural consequence of her own choices. She did not hear him until he was already beside her. The guards stopped. The Alpha King said nothing to them, and they stepped back 2 paces and found an interest in the corridor wall. He walked alongside her for 4 steps before he slowed, and she slowed because stopping felt less exposed than matching his pace, and they stood in one of the shadowed stretches between 2 torch sconces, with the guards at a distance that was technically within hearing and practically arranged to be out of it. He looked at her left wrist. The chain mark was still visible above her cuff, the raised red line of it, the bracket shape the shackle had pressed into skin over 3 days of wearing. He looked at it the way he had looked at it in the hall, 2 full seconds, then the expression closing, and then his hand moved. She felt the air shift before she felt the proximity, his right hand coming up at his side, the fingers barely extending toward the mark. They stopped. He pulled them back. She did not look at his hand. She looked at the stone wall past his shoulder and waited. He said, "You named the Blood Moon territorial claim in the hearing." "Yes." "Varek will use it as grounds to accelerate the Marin arrangement." A pause. "You should know that." She turned to look at him then. He was watching her with an expression she could not name, not cold exactly, more the expression of a man who has calculated a series of outcomes and is informing someone of a result they have not yet reached on their own. "Lord Marin," she said, "his faction has been requesting a border territory bond for 3 seasons. Varek offered it in exchange for a council vote. Your bloodline claim on the Eastern Territory makes you useful to that arrangement." He said it without inflection, which was its own kind of information. "Varek did not bring it before the full council. The arrangement has not received the king's seal." She understood what he was not saying, and then she also understood that she should not count on it. He took 1 step back. The guards came off the wall with the practiced smoothness of men who had been watching without appearing to. He said to her, before he turned, Do not name anyone in the full court hearing, not even to deny them." She did not answer. He left. She let the guards take her back to the East Wing room, and she sat on the bed in the brazier light and thought about what it meant that the Alpha King of Ironfall had stood in a dim corridor and told her, in so many words, that the arrangement against her had a procedural hole in it. Either he was giving her hope he had no intention of honoring, or the hole mattered to him for a reason he had not explained. She did not know which it was. She was not certain he did either. Bryn came that evening. He did not bring a tray. He came to the door and stood in the opening with his Omega cord at his wrist and his hands empty. And the way he stood told her before he opened his mouth that he had something to say that he had been deciding about for some time. "Lord Marin's riders arrived at the south gate this afternoon," he said. "6 of them. They're lodged in the lower hall." She looked at him. "The bond arrangement. It's being treated as already agreed." He kept his voice low and level. "The right follows the full court sentence. Varric has the binding done first, the sentence converted to transfer custody." He paused. "That's what I've heard." "From the corridor outside the elders' meeting room," she said. 6 riders. Marin brought 6. Varric arranged for the right room to be prepared 2 hours after the full court hearing. He looked at the floor. "I thought you should know how much time you have." She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark inner courtyard, and she thought about what it felt like to have spent 12 years at a border ruin, building a working knowledge of a territory no one else wanted, holding a bloodline claim that the hierarchy had decided had dissolved along with everything else. She had been careful. She had been quiet. She had not made herself useful to anyone's arrangement. She said to the window, "Thank you, Bryn." He left without a sound. She did not sleep. Near the middle of the night, the bolt on her door moved. She was already sitting up when Kalen opened it. He came in alone, without a guard, without a candle, and the only light in the room was the brazier's low burn that made everything in it the color of embers. He stood inside the door and looked at her, and said nothing for long enough that she understood he had come here without deciding entirely what he intended to say. She waited. "The Marin arrangement," he said finally. "Varric did not bring it before the full council. He does not have the required seal." He stopped. Began again. "I can void it on procedural grounds." She looked at him steadily. "And the charge?" "Lyra has been in the record hall since this afternoon." He was quiet for a moment. "The border warden Ordrin's death record exists. Ironfall keeps one for every warden at every crossing. If the date on the record does not match the date on the writ's foundation does not hold." She felt something move in her chest that she refused to call relief. "What does the record say?" "Lyra has not returned yet." He said it simply, a fact and not a reassurance. He looked at the brazier. He looked at the chain mark on her wrist. "If the record does not say what I believe it says, I can do nothing with the procedural argument alone. Varric has 4 of the 5 elders, and he has Marin's faction." She said, "And if it does say what you believe?" He looked at her. "Then I will say so." In the hall. "Before everyone Varric assembled to watch you sentenced." The thing she refused to call relief moved again, and she held it at a careful distance. She said, "You lose the Marin faction's council vote, and the border territory arrangement. That faction has been useful to the throne." "Yes," he said without hesitation, which told her he had already calculated this. She looked at him for a long moment in the brazier light. Whatever this was, it was not theater. It was not political calculation dressed as mercy. It was a man who had decided something at real cost and had not pretended otherwise about it. She did not ask why. She said only, "Tell Lyra to look at the date." He was gone before she heard the bolt settle. The full court hearing was called for mid-morning. The great hall looked the same as it had on her first night in Ironfall. The same 50 torches in their iron sconces, the same packed benches of court wolves in dark dress, the same weight of assembled authority pressing the stone floor into something heavier than stone. The 5 council elders occupied their seats at the front of the room. Varric stood at the center before the dais, in the position of a man who had arranged this proceeding and was entirely comfortable inside it. She was brought in through the main doors. No chains this time. The procedural record would show she had been extended that courtesy. The room's attention turned to her the way it had on the first night, with that same quality of anticipation that assemblies carry when they have already agreed on the ending and are present only for the ceremony of it. Varric said, "The council has weighed the defense. The Blood Moon Remnant holds no standing to refuse the council's resolution. The record is clear." The Blood Moon Remnant. Again. In front of the same hall where he had named her that on her first night. She had not forgotten the phrasing. She thought he relied on it because it had worked before, when the Blood Moon Pact dissolved, and its daughters scattered, and no one was left who could stand in the right room and contest it. He continued, "Given the refusal to cooperate with the Council's resolution, and given the absence of credible defense, sentencing is as follows. The defendant is treaty flesh. Nothing more. Transfer of custody to Lord Marin's bond arrangement, formalized by territorial right, effective at the conclusion of this hearing. Treaty flesh. Nothing more." She did not move. She did not look at the floor. She looked at Varric, kept her hands at her sides, and let the sentence land in the room without giving the room the satisfaction of watching it land on her. Across the hall, near the back entrance, Lord Marin's 6 riders stood in a cluster, and the man at their center was dressed in the formal dark wool of a territorial claim ceremony, and he was watching her with the proprietary attention of someone who has purchased something and is waiting for it to be handed over. She did not look at him. She was not certain, in that moment, whether the record had said what Kaelin believed it would say. She was not certain whether Lyra had returned. She was not certain whether it mattered, because Varric had 4 of the 5 elders, and the procedural argument alone was not enough. And the hall was full of witnesses who had come to watch the Blood Moon Remnant be handed to a territorial arrangement that would permanently erase whatever claim she had left. She told herself, "Stand here. Whatever happens, stand here with your spine straight and your chin level, and give them nothing." The main doors at the back of the hall opened. Not the side entrance, not the council's private door. The main doors, the full-length ones, that the entire court could be seen through when they swung wide. They opened, and Kaelin walked through them. The hall's noise stopped. He walked the length of the floor at the same unhurried pace she had watched him cross the stone 4 days ago, and the assembled court moved back from the aisle as he passed. Not dramatically, just the instinctive half-step that bodies make when something with a great deal of gravity passes nearby. Lyra walked behind him, carrying a document case of the same leather-bound type the lead rider had carried to her door at the border ruin. He stopped in front of Varric. He did not look at Varric. He looked at her. He said, "The Marin arrangement is void." Varric said, "My lord, the arrangement has been approved by council resolution and is pending the completion of the territorial right." The arrangement was approved by 4 members of the council without the king's seal, which the procedural record requires for any territorial bond transfer. Kaelin's voice was level and carried without effort in the silent hall. It was not a council resolution. It was Varric's arrangement. He paused. Lyra. Lyra opened the document case. She drew out a single folded page and read from it without preliminary. Ironfall's Border Warden Record, Northern Crossing. Warden Ordrin. Date of death, the 12th day of the Grey Turning. She refolded it. The writ names the 14th day. The defendant was seized on the grounds that she crossed the northern border on the 14th. The warden she is accused of killing was already dead 2 days before that crossing could have occurred. The hall did not breathe. Kaelin looked at Varric. "The writ is a forgery." assembled on the council seal without a king's seal, naming a date that does not match Ironfall's own record, brought against a woman whose bloodline claim on the Eastern Territory was a procedural obstacle to your arrangement with Marin. He let that sit for 3 full seconds. You will step back from the elder's bench. Varek's face did not change at once. Then it did. The particular change of a face that has understood in one instant that the ground it was standing on no longer exists. The fifth elder, the one who had not moved during the prior hearing, rose from the bench and said, "The council formally removes Elder Varek from the bench pending review of all proceedings bearing his seal." Lord Marin's 6 riders did not wait to be addressed. They moved toward the main doors in the same cluster they had arrived in, and the hall made room for them with the collective speed of people who want to be clearly not associated with a position that has just collapsed. Kaelin turned back to her. He crossed to where she stood and stopped close enough that she could see the precise line of his jaw in the torchlight, and the hall was looking at them both. And she understood that what came next would happen in front of everyone in Ironfall with the standing to be present, which was what he had come in through the main doors to ensure. He said, "Your bloodline claim on the Blood Moon territory is intact, the Eastern Ruin and the Northern Crossing, both." He said it to her and to the room. "The Blood Moon line is not a remnant." His voice did not increase in volume. It did not need to. "It stands in this hall." She felt her breath catch at the back of her throat and held herself very still. He said, "I name Darius of Bloodmoon under the protection of the Ironfall throne." The hall shifted. She felt it rather than heard it, the specific quality of a large assembly absorbing something that cannot be taken back and arranging itself accordingly. He extended his right hand. She looked at it. She looked at his face. She thought about the border ruin and the fire and the bedroll that had seen better winters and the 7 riders coming through the frost-stripped tree line at first light. She thought about Bryn's 2 words in the holding room and what it had cost him to say them. She thought about Varek, naming her remnant in this hall on her first night in it, in front of every witness he could assemble. She put her hand in his. His thumb moved to the chain mark on her left wrist, to the faint raised bracket of skin, and rested there. Not the half-completed movement from the corridor. A full, deliberate placement, his hand warm on the mark, covering it completely. She heard, from somewhere in the packed benches, the sound of the assembly adjusting itself. Not applause. Something quieter and more permanent, the sound of a room whose map has been redrawn and whose inhabitants are beginning to understand where everything now sits. Varek was escorted from the hall by 2 of the council's senior guards. He walked without speaking. He did not look at her as he passed. The 5th elder inclined his head toward her by a degree that she understood, in this room and with this audience, to be a great deal. The days that followed moved differently than anything that had come before. The Blood Moon territorial claim was entered into Ironfall's record under her name, both crossings confirmed, the 12-year gap in the ledger annotated and closed. She was given rooms in the Upper East Wing, not the corridor below it, and the difference between the two was the difference between a window that looked onto an unused courtyard and a window that looked onto the full width of the inner grounds. 3 weeks after the hall, on a morning when the frost had come back into the courtyard stones and the light was the particular clean gray of early cold, she walked into the great hall for the first time since the sentencing. Not summoned. She went because she wanted to, which was its own kind of evidence that something had shifted in how she understood her standing there. The hall was quiet. The benches were empty. She crossed the stone floor the same way she had crossed it on her first night, from the main doors toward the dais, and the room felt different at her own pace, without a guard at either shoulder and iron at her wrists. Bryn was standing at the back wall, not in service position, not carrying a tray. standing with his hands at his sides and the omega cord replaced at his wrist by the simple braided leather of an unbound man, which she had arranged 3 days after the hall through the same procedural channels the hierarchy understood, and the fifth elder had countersigned without objection. He looked at her when she came in. He did not incline his head in the service position. He looked at her, the way a person looks at another person they are glad to see, which is different in every particular from the look of a servant taking account of an assignment. She crossed to him and stood beside him, and they both looked at the hall's full length together, the empty benches, the dais, the 50 torch sconces running the walls, many of them dark at this hour. She had entered this room in chains. She had stood at its center while her standing was named as nothing. She had watched Varric take up the word remnant and press it into her like a brand, in front of every witness he could gather, and she had let it touch her without answering it, because the only answer she had was the truth, and the truth had seemed, for 3 consecutive days, to be insufficient. Kalen came in from the side entrance near the dais. He crossed to her without ceremony, without the court assembled to witness it, and stood on her other side and looked at the hall, the way she was looking at it. His hand found her left wrist by the same motion it had found it 3 weeks ago, his thumb settling over the chain mark, which had faded now to a faint raised line, barely readable in the gray morning light, but still there. She did not need to look at him. She stood in the hall where Varric had named her nothing, in the morning quiet, with Kalen's hand warm on the fading mark, and Bryn beside her as a free man, and the Blood Moon territorial claim written into Ironfall's record in her own name. The hall held the kind of silence that does not need to be filled. That was what she had.